Does the MCU need a reboot? This has been a very prominent question within the fanbase for a good number of years, especially since we got the announcements of, before Doomsday, Kang Dynasty, and then Secret Wars. And now with the Jonathan Majors situation that happened, with it being changed from Kang Dynasty to Doomsday, then leading into Secret Wars, the question has come up once more: does the MCU have to be completely reset and rebooted in order for anything to keep this universe going? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, because the answer isn't as simple as a lot of people will bring up, because there is valid points for wanting it to be rebooted and wanting it to stay the same. And there are definitely pros and cons to each. And look, let's not pretend that the idea of the MCU needing a reboot hasn't come from the fact that Marvel has not brought out consistently really well done movies and shows back to back. More so recently, it had way too many misses than hits, and there is a whole lot of things to break down into the MCU and what worked, what didn't work, and why things didn't work, but that's besides the point. The issue is that people want a reboot for the MCU, but at the same time, people also want it to be the same, because otherwise everything that happened previously would ultimately amount to nothing. Similarly to what happened with the DCEU, with Zack Snyder's DC Universe, and now we're having James Gunn's DC Universe being built up from scratch as an entirely brand new thing. Though of course the difference is that Zack Snyder's DC Universe for its movies was like 90% like not good or just forgettable. Meanwhile, now with the fresh start, we have the potential of things getting built up to be something great. The building blocks are there for James Gunn's DCU, but we still need to see a bit more before we can have any definitive answers. The MCU, however, has had 20 years of storytelling, or well, almost 20 years of storytelling up until this point. And so it feels like if we reboot it, everything would mean nothing. So let's go with the pros and cons of rebooting the MCU and the pros and cons of not rebooting the MCU. Let's start with the side that doesn't want a reboot at all. Let's say Secret Wars happens and everything just flat out remains the same at the end. The status quo for all the characters that have lived, died, and the characters that we see later on in Doomsday are basically the exact same, with maybe the sole exception of the Fantastic Four being brought to the main universe potentially, and the existence of mutants being brought into Marvel. There is some genuinely good stuff we could have here, because let's say the Fantastic Four are just plopped right into the MCU as just brand new characters having to start their lives over in a new universe where they otherwise wouldn't have existed. That could be an interesting story for the Fantastic Four sequel. That would be pretty interesting to see and have them build their mark in the world and potentially set things up to be brand new, and that's different types of character struggles that we could end up exploring with Marvel's first family. But at the same time, we lose out on that implied history that we had with the Fantastic Four from the Fantastic Four First Steps movie, with the years of them building themselves up to be heroes, their own rogues gallery, and characters that they have faced throughout the years. We throw them into the MCU, but they lose basically almost all of their entire history in the process. We could say with the exception of Doctor Doom, but let's face it, Robert Downey Jr. is not going to remain Doctor Doom for the entirety of the MCU. I really doubt that. If they do, then that just takes away the role from another actor to actually bring Doom to life in a different way, and that would be kind of disappointing. And then we have the whole X-Men situation. That would be a big pro in terms of longevity of storytelling in the MCU. You can tell so many stories with the mutants, and having all these characters interact with different Marvel characters, like with the comics, can make a whole boatload of different team-ups and story ideas by mixing people together. You could have a bunch of X-Men stories with the Fantastic Four, with the Avengers, with Spider-Man. There's a whole plethora of books from the comics that you could take inspiration from. But here's the downside. The MCU has basically been playing with the idea of mutants just appearing in the universe for a couple of years now, with the most obvious one being with the ending of the Miss Marvel TV show, and basically telling us that Kamala Khan is a mutant, setting up for the possibility of like actual humans with natural born mutations for their powers and abilities. Now that is cool and can give some sense of exploration, but then you have the lore and logistical nightmare of having to try and explain why no one has ever seen or interacted with mutants all this time, because mutants have existed for a long time within the Marvel universe when it comes to the comics and even some TV shows. There's a point where okay, you can explain away to a bit where there are so few mutants out there that some people would just explain it away as something else, make it like the Hulk, or maybe they were Asgardian like Thor or something like that, or some human experiment gone wrong and that's how they got their powers, and the whole idea of people natural being born with abilities just kept them underground. A popular theory to make it make sense to a degree is Charles Xavier using super high level telepathy to mess with everyone's mind so that they don't know what mutants are, to keep mutants hidden from the world. But when you think about that for a second, second, even with comic book logic, it makes no sense, especially with everything that's happened with like with the snap in the MCU, and it would make no clear sense. And so just making the mutants just appear in the MCU out of nowhere kind of will make a big mess of the timeline of the whole instance of the vast history and lore of mutants, especially as the comics keep expanding more on the actual history of mutants within the Marvel universe. So that's something that we really can't fully explore by just plopping mutants in the MCU just like that and just expecting the lore to just come right afterwards and just build it from there. It's not like how the MCU has been previously, where they had to build the lore after Tony Stark has Iron Man, and then everything just slowly but surely gets unraveled with more heroes on Earth popping up. The cosmic side of things makes sense with things being off on their own up until later, but with the mutants very closely tied to Earth, so that's a whole big thing. The cons far outweigh the pros when it comes to these characters being placed in the MCU directly after Secret Wars, because you have to do some Olympic level hoop jumping to try and make their existences and stories in the MCU make sense if you want everything from now to be exactly the same. So a full-blown reboot of the Marvel universe sounds better than keeping the universe exactly the same and just trying to plop in new characters and just try and explain away everything from that point onwards, and it would make later introductions of, like, say, the mutants feel very off and different to the point where you have to try and explain everything away, like, oh, Apocalypse or Krakoa were here all along, you just didn't realize it for some reason, or Magneto didn't do anything for mutants for all these years after World War II and everything because he's a Holocaust survivor. That's the whole thing with Magneto. There's a whole lot of things that you really need to try and explain away in such a convoluted manner to try and make things make sense. So I really don't think just keeping the MCU exactly the same, just throwing the X-Men and mutants and the Fantastic Four just straight in there would just make things way more trouble than it would be worth. Now for the full-blown reboot of the MCU, that has its obvious pros and cons. Let's start with the pros. The pros is a fresh, clean start. You can start with a brand new slate of characters, new movies to prop up the universe. Obviously, we're getting work on an X-Men trilogy right now, or a set of X-Men movies taking place within the MCU. So we'll start from there, probably start with the First Class being the first team of X-Men, Cyclops, Jean Grey, Iceman, Angel, and Beast. We'll have them, and then we'll expand out through there. And since everyone's real people, we can have each of these couple of stories with different movies and expanding out to other X-Men teams and titles to explore more of mutants in the new MCU, and thus exploring literally every mutant ever created through Marvel if we really want to, but we'll just focus on the main ones, obviously, and the grand lore, political intrigue, and eventually get to, like, say, Apocalypse or some of the space stuff, or the real philosophical debates with mutants that we can get into in the MCU. Spider-Man will probably still be in the MCU, probably still played by Tom Holland most likely, unless they recast him, but we still have 2 more movies in a Tom Holland trilogy, so they're probably going to keep Tom Holland, maybe rewrite his history if anything, but keep him roughly the same. If that's the case, we do a full-blown reboot. Fantastic Four, all set up to be incredibly brand new, and so on and so forth. For basically every other character, we'd probably have to recast like 90% of the MCU, unless the actors are young enough. We'd have to recast basically everybody, and start completely fresh like the DCU, and build the stories up from a new set of pillars. Instead of Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man to start off the universes, it could be Fantastic Four, X-Men, Spider-Man, and if Universal aren't assholes about it, the Hulk. Because Lord knows we need a new Hulk movie for the first time in, almost 20 years with that also. My God, we need a Hulk movie so bad. Which honestly, that'll be another real pro for the MCU. We start over with the Hulk and try and establish an actual storyline and not get a off-screen development for Bruce Banner to become Professor Hulk. Granted, Spider-Man Brand New Day is basically confirming to us that we're going to see Savage Hulk appear again, so maybe we'll get proper development in the future for the MCU. But yeah, a full reboot is literally just everything was just erased and done, and we start completely fresh. Maybe keep up some of the other actors from beforehand if they are young enough to reprise their roles in new stories for new versions of their characters. The pros means fresh stories and stuff like that, and we don't have to worry about 20 years of continuity. But the cons are pretty drastic, because that means all the stories, characters, and everything that we've experienced thus far effectively meant nothing, giving us the idea that everything was a waste of time. That's what a lot of people feel about the DCEU. We spent more or less 8 years, if we're being honest with ourselves, 8-9 years in this one universe. And yeah, a lot of stuff was kind of more misses than hits for the majority of the DCEU, but we spent a lot of time with it, and then it just got thrown away, and thus we effectively wasted our time, and there was no definitive conclusion. For the MCU, if there's a definitive conclusion, we'll wait a couple of years and restart again. then fine. But with how things are going, with there being more movies and shows beginning to get planned out post Secret Wars, that's not gonna happen. So we're most likely gonna have to we're definitely not gonna do a full reboot, but the cons do definitely even out with the pros, but a lot of the casual audience probably won't really like a full-blown reboot because the characters that they've seen throughout the years, even ones that did die, would effectively be pointless and you'd have to start all over, and that's a whole big thing. Which is why a reboot and staying exactly the same is not the best option. The best option that I think is to meet in the middle and do pretty much what the comics did for Secret Wars, and it being a soft reset, not a soft reboot. Basically, the events of the MCU will be more or less the same, but certain aspects of it will be altered. We'll have past characters recast if you want to keep them alive and bring more stories for past characters like Iron Man or Captain America or Thor, and perhaps even the Guardians of the Galaxy if possible, or Brie Larson probably stay as Captain Marvel. Some of the younger Avengers characters can stay as they are. Tom Holland will stay Spider-Man. You could recast Mark Ruffalo for a different actor to play the Hulk and Bruce Banner, but you can keep it the same potentially, but younger actors preferably would be best, and thus we can start the MCU continuing, but with actual differences. Effectively, it would kind of rewrite the history of the MCU to the point where a lot of these events are practically the same, but you can write it in that since the Secret Wars and do everything that Doom did with the incursions in Secret Wars potentially just made it so that a lot of the events of the X-Men's history and mutants and the Fantastic Four's history have always been a part of the MCU, kind of a loose canonicity to it, so that you can just explain, okay, they were kind of there to this point, or they were preoccupied with other stuff at the time, so they couldn't participate in this final battle, so stuff like that, because the Fantastic Four are always in other dimensions or in space. Same with the X-Men. They've got their own stuff going on, so you can kind of offhandedly explain why they wouldn't be there during the battles of Infinity War and Endgame, but you can still expect them to be technically there in the universe, and thus it wouldn't fully clash with the canonicity of every MCU event up until this point. And a soft reset or a soft reboot essentially would still mean that the events that happened up until this point did not mean nothing. Just some events happened differently, or the event of Secret Wars just brought characters back to life, maybe rewrote some memories to the point where they never died in the first place as type of a, kind of gift. For all we know, for all the trials and tribulations, it could be like a thing that Doom does to kind of make up for what he did in Doomsday and Secret Wars. Maybe Reed Richards did something to rewrite stuff or whatever. We don't know what Doomsday and Secret Wars are going to be, but characters will be brought back. They'll probably be recast, and then we can see how those stories develop going forward. Keeping the story of the MCU constantly going, but not have it be fully marked too much by the general age of it, as we have the different people play different characters, like a type of soft reset, and make it be acknowledged that everybody was kind of roughly the same. Multiverse collapsed, came back together, different people are looking like different characters, and effectively is considered being brought back to life, and characters will probably not remember the events of Secret Wars, save for maybe a select few characters, and that will end up being potentially lead up into some stuff for the next saga of the MCU, or maybe not. It could just be a little thing that could be done in movies of other characters, like Reed Richards can still remember stuff from, pre-Secret Wars. Captain America, if he's cast as a different person, will probably still have memories of pre-Secret Wars. Spider-Man, who knows? Either way, a soft reset / soft reboot is the best option for the MCU right now. A full-blown reboot would basically make everything pointless, even though we do get a fresh, clean slate. It would honestly be way too soon with how constantly expanding the MCU has been, even though it has been messy, and keeping everything exactly the same, just plopping in like the X-Men and the Fantastic Four would make things way too bloated and make way too much convoluted nonsense to try and explain everything away and make everything make sense for why all this stuff just appeared right after Secret Wars and everything just remained exactly the same. Soft reset keeps the integrity of the baseline timeline of the MCU the same, but has implications, stuff like that, with slight rewrites of the history to make it so that these other characters from these other universes that never existed in the MCU were there in the first place, with small hand-waving stuff that they weren't around due to particular reasons, and thus keeps the integrity of the MCU timeline the same, even though it is kind of annoying. It is the best option to do post-Secret Wars to kind of make everything make sense and not make everything be for nothing and make a bigger headache for yourself and trying to bring the new stuff in and trying to make it make sense through the overall timeline of things. But those are just my general and long-winded thoughts on the fact that the MCU doesn't need a reboot. It doesn't need to stay exactly the same. A soft reset is the best course of action, in my opinion, for the MCU. But let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. And once more, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell for updates on future videos, and hype up the video to boost in the algorithm and show you guys enjoy what I make on the channel and shows you want to see more. I'm obviously going to be talking talking more MCU stuff going forward. We're going to get a Doomsday trailer at some point, and when Doomsday comes out, same with Spider-Man Brand New Day, I'm going to talk about it, so look forward to all that, and look forward to all the other comic book content I'm going to be making here in the future. But with all that said and done, hope you all have an awesome day.